28% of the parliament in Egypt, and then they were repressed heavily until, of course, the uprising, in which, by the way, they didn't participate very early on. But that's a different story. They watch in 2006 what's happening in Gaza, and they see Hamas winning elections and how they were excommunicated by the entire world and by the PA, the Palestinian Authority. And then they look at the Sunnis being repressed by the Syrian regime inside Syria. They look at how the Americans actually removed the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, and with it the Sunni leadership, and basically provided favorable conditions and support and propped up the Shi'is. From that perspective, again, this is how this is being seen. And a lot of it is not untrue. And then this model person looks at the powers in the region, the fighting forces in the region, and they see Hezbollah as the most important fighting force, and they see Iran as a strong fighting force, they see the Syrian regime as a strong fighting force, and they are not seeing a Sunni fighting force that actually has a Sunni agenda. And that creates psychological, emotional identification with a role that needs to be played. Now, those people despise ISIS. They do not like ISIS. But there is a kind of relationship there that is difficult to explain, because to explain it, you will fall into either Islamophobia or Orientalism or something of the sort. But it's important to recognize that there is a feeling that there is a kind of repression or marginalization of Sunniism. So ISIS basically emerged out of this context and, of course, took these kinds of feelings, both real and imagined and perceived, to their logical conclusion, and they are actually carrying out what they think needs to be carried out by a Sunni force in the region, at least in the Levant. So that's something to ponder. Okay, so these are some of the causes that have produced this dynamic, this group, and it's intersecting with what's happening in Syria. So we have a serious set of problems that are not just about the Arab-Israeli conflict and anti-imperialism and fighting dictatorship. This is also a perception of sectarianism. And of course, Saudi Arabia was supposed to be on the side of ISIS until ISIS became a Frankenstein that it could not control, so it pulled back. So did Qatar, Turkey, the United States, and others. They pulled back from supporting any fighting force that's willing to fight the Syrian regime, which was, for the most part, the plan. And that plan fell apart largely because the Syrian regime wasn't falling as quickly as they anticipated, because their anticipation was that it doesn't matter who you support, since the Syrian regime is likely to fall as quickly or somewhat as quickly as the other regimes in the region, but they didn't. And then as a function of the lack of a defeat for the Syrian regime, there was room for the growth of ISIS-like groups, and of course they took advantage of it in the best possible way. So that's ISIS. Going now beyond the local groups, we have the regional conflicts, and I shared some of these, between, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and then on the other hand, Iran, Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime. These are regional conflicts that have actually predated the uprisings, even if there used to be some relationships between, say, Saudi Arabia and Syria at one point. These are important conflicts, and the fault lines become more and more sectarian in a more and more violent context. And indeed, the demographics speak to that as well, with the exception that in Syria the majority is Sunni, but the majority is not viewed as being in control. Beyond that, of course, Turkey played a role on the side of conservative Arab states early on, and it was actually quite aggressive early on, and now they have pulled back, and they too have realized the kind of unintended consequences of pushing any fighting force. And of course, all of this happened at the expense of being interested in building a broad and independent Syrian opposition, right? The main fault of the opposition, we can talk about this in the Q&A, was to, the opposition and their patrons, was to support any fighting force or anything that can defeat the regime, rather than build a serious opposition that's independent, that's broad, that is inclusive. And in a way that had to be done, given any kind of analysis of the coherence and cohesion of the Syrian regime, should have actually pushed people to move in that direction because of the differences between the Syrian regime, for instance, and the likelihood that it will disintegrate or it will experience serious defections compared to Tunisia and Egypt. We can get to that later. Besides these conflicts in the region, of course, you have the basic, boilerplate right now, of course, unfortunately, the Arab-Israeli conflict that actually also interferes in this kind of analysis and this kind of setting, with Israel, interestingly and ironically and unexpectedly, being a lot less aggressive in terms of its support for the removal of Assad. And of course, this is a function also of a debate within Israel, just like there are debates. I mean, even within ISIS, there are debates. If people don't realize this, you should. And within Israel as well, there were debates about whether to get rid of Assad or not to get rid of Assad, at least in terms of preference. And the idea, of course, those who did not want to be aggressive in terms of pushing Assad out, kind of won out policy-wise, and that's largely because Israel had more of an interest in having a strong regime in Syria that can control its population and prevent the emergence of Hezbollah-like movement that would actually cause harm, which is the only force that caused Israel harm and kind of challenged, if not broke, the invincibility, the idea of the invincibility of the Israeli army. But Israel does not want a regime strong enough to be able to threaten it. This is why they were happy with Bashar. Okay, and then of course we have the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi conflicts, which actually fall into the respectively the category of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which is another way where Qatar and Saudi Arabia themselves are actually not on the same. I have 30 more minutes, so I talk.
No, that's your signal. You have your
Okay, that's okay. I only have to talk about these two now, right now. So we move from this kind of intersection of conflicts and intersection of struggles to the Syrian uprising itself, and how did we get here? Because the Syrian uprising started as an uprising against the authoritarian regime. It got basically entangled in all of these different dimensions that I shared. The regime also helped catalyze the militarization of the opposition and the radicalization of the opposition, both by leaving its borders somewhat open and by releasing from prison various leaders of many of these movements, including Al-Julani, who was the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other supporters of the opposition were also, and some people say have actually predated in terms of their support, the emergence of the uprising, have actually supported financially and otherwise the emergence of various networks and cells within Syria. The point is, after the uprising started, both parties, the Syrian regime and outside powers, have actually played a significant role in the catalyzation of the weaponization and militarization of the Syrian uprising. Now, in terms of causes, it's really important to think about two things. You've got to think about the structural causes that are accumulated over decades, which basically constitute, in some way, like a stack of hay that must be present in order to have the potential of mass mobilization. But uprisings and revolutions don't start because you have a collection of resentment and discontent and repression and so on and so forth, and exploitation. They start because of some sort of instigator or a spark. So these are two different things. Of course, in Syria, the stack of hay, in my view, as much as it might seem is higher or bigger than the stack of hay elsewhere, it's actually not. Not because there is no repression, it's actually the most repressive, but because in Syria there has been for decades a kind of policy of leveling egalitarianism that has actually created some sort of stability. That policy, that kind of approach began to break down in the early to mid-1990s, and by 2010 was actually not what it was. Still, the provision by the public sector, which is the largest single employer until today in Syria, of welfare goods and services, healthcare, education, and so on, is at a level that is a bit more efficient and a bit more ubiquitous than in other countries, including Egypt and Tunisia. So in a way, you have a kind of incomplete, if you will, structural factors in Syria for a full-fledged, ubiquitous uprising throughout the entire country, as opposed to probably other cases. And there are positive factors in other cases that we can speak about, but ultimately there is something about the readiness to go to the streets in Syria that was not right? However, the spark, the instigator, was the semi-success of the Tunisian and the Egyptian uprisings, which basically pushed people in Dir'a in southern Syria to go to the streets after these kids were tortured as a result of them writing down with the regime on the walls. The idea here is that the Syrian regime had, in many ways, protected and developed the metropolitan cities in ways that made it very difficult for a ubiquitous uprising to take place. In fact, until almost 2 years, both metropolitan cities were relatively shielded from the uprising. Of course, Aleppo began to fall apart. Damascus is still doing okay, and that's a result of the presence of the Syrian regime there. Now, the larger question in terms of the decades preceding the uprising is the question of socio-economic policies in Syria, which constitute, for the most part, the kind of change that took place, because authoritarianism as a variable proceeded from 1963 until 2011. It did not actually change. It spiked in the 70s and 80s and kind of subsided afterwards. What changed is this policy of shifting alliances from labor to business in the 1980s and 1990s, whereby the Syrian regime began to embark on social policies that slowly provided more and more rights to capitalists, and business people, and including their own cronies, including their own offspring, which by then, a regime like Syria that does not involve rotation at the level of party bureaucracy, army, security services, and government, government includes a bit more rotation. The offspring of this cohort basically was born into a country that they kind of owned, or they felt they owned, and they went into business, and that was a major propelling force for the regime to actually embark on the kind of neoliberal policies that it wasn't actually forced to embark on or compelled to embark on as a function of the conditionality that, for instance, Jordan, Egypt, and Tunisia were under. But the changing class structure and the changing social composition of the leadership in Syria, with the same people remaining in power, but their changing social position, is what began to shift these alliances from labor to business, from a centralized economy to a more mixed economy that is very crony-like. That shift, which was somewhat complete in the 1990s, began to eat up the kind of egalitarianism that existed in Syria. And by 2005, when Bashar consolidated his rule after his father died in 2000, what we saw in Syria is a speeding up of neoliberal policies that not only took away rights and resources from the populist forces, or the masses, or labor, if you will, they began to actually withdraw the last line of defense for most Syrians, and that is subsidies, food subsidies, oil subsidies, and as a result, within 5 years, Syrian society looked extremely different, even if people were not yet ready to go to the streets. I keep arguing that in the absence of the uprisings next door, Syrians weren't going to go to the streets in 2011. So by 2010, however, we had two forms of polarization in Syria that provided the hay that basically just required a spark. We had a vertical social polarization between rich and poor, and that's a crude way of putting it. It's much more complex, and we need to illustrate how this actually took place as a function of these policies. But ultimately, we have a vertical social polarization between rich and poor, which was coupled also over the past 25 years with a horizontal social polarization between the countryside and the metropolitan cities as a result of the neglect of the countryside and the government's socioeconomic policies and development policies. This kind of double social polarization was hardest for the people of the countryside, largely because they were hit by both of these forms of polarization. They were hit as the underclass or the working class or the populist forces, and they were also hit as the rural inhabitants, who, on top of all of this, between 2002, 2003, and 2008, 2009, were hit by an incredible drought that caused 1.2 million people migrating to the cities. And that, in many ways, created a level of discontent in the countryside in Syria, especially in Syria, which explains why the uprising started in Syria. In fact, not just Syria is a case where this is what happened in terms of the countryside being sparked, but also Tunisia. Of course, the spark wasn't Tunis, the capital. It was where Bouazizi was inhabiting, which is a rural area. In Egypt, it didn't start in Tahrir. People got to Tahrir from other places, and then, of course, it became the center. So it's also important to understand this regional effect, not just in Syria, but in the whole region generally, and recognize that it's part and parcel of some of the socioeconomic policies that were pursued. Of course, the spark was the Dir'a incident, which produced not a movement to remove the regime, but a movement to call for the removal of the corrupt persons within the regime and to battle corruption. So it was a movement that carried the picture of Bashar Assad's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who is said to control more than 30% of the strategic assets of the private sector. This was the demand. Even the first few weeks, the demand had little to do with the regime itself. It became an issue of removing the regime as a result of the naked repression where regime officials or officers were actually shooting at civilians. And we can talk about the complexity of how quickly the civilians shot back in some cases, or people that are within the civilian body shot back and created more chaos, because there's a lot of debate about the purity of the first few months. We assume that there was a purity, but the more we look into what was happening, that purity was not exactly ubiquitous. I'll close with talking about the regime strategy very quickly in terms of maintaining its power even after 4 years of a brutal uprising in which more than 200,000 people were killed and in which more than 9.5 to 10 million people were displaced internally and externally. The regime strategy, the Syrian regime strategy, developed in 3 ways from the very beginning. The first thing that they wanted to do is speed up the militarization of the uprising in order to undermine the legitimacy of the uprising, knowing that these groups would become radicalized and they would present something that is an alternative that is not necessarily desirable for many Syrians, and that external meddling will increase the radicalization of such groups who will ultimately spearhead the revolution, which undermines the revolution. So that was always, from the very beginning, a regime strategy. The second strategy is to radicalize the opposition through the release of extremists from jail and allowing for the entry, almost in a deliberate manner, through Syria's various borders of foreign fighters. Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon were relatively open in terms of getting into Syria, in some places more than others. And that basically created the same effect that the United States wished to create in Iraq, except that the Syrian regime was, of course, able to control certain areas and knew that it could control them up to any point in their mind. And actually they have succeeded because of this third strategy that we don't hear about very much. And that is to seize and maintain control of city centers through the provision of goods and services as well as salaries, the continuous provision of goods and services as well as salaries, while destroying city centers that are controlled by the opposition. You have all heard the strategy of the brutal strategy of the barrel bombs, throwing barrel bombs in the hundreds on city centers throughout Syria that are city centers controlled by the opposition. The problem or the issue of these barrel bombs is not that they are an efficient military strategy. In fact, it does not have a military effect. What it does, what these barrel bombs have done, is that they have actually killed the potential of life in city centers that are not controlled by the regime. And that act produced migration from city centers controlled by the opposition to city centers or the countryside or small towns controlled by the regime nearby. And that continued the semblance of the existence of the state, even as some of these bureaucrats and Baathists and functionaries of government, even as they existed or still exist under ISIS. They still get their paychecks, they still get support, and the continuing strategy of destroying city centers continues to create a safe haven among regime territories, and basically almost the absence of life, like in Homs, in areas that used to be controlled by the opposition, which means that the opposition ends up, for the most part, leaving, and then regime reclaims those cities, and of course assumes that one day it will rebuild. Now, what's going to happen after this, I do not know, but I'm happy to talk about whatever